Hi, everyone. Glad to see people waiting patiently for this. We really enjoy everyone's promptness. We have a very special guest with us today, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to him. Dennis, go ahead and begin.
Okay, thank you, Ava. I'm Dennis Schatz, informal science educator, worked at the Pacific Science Center for now 42 years, a long time, and obviously an advocate for out-of-school learning and the importance of it. And I'm delighted that there are so many people here to participate in this. And what I'm planning to do, I've got some PowerPoint slides, as you would expect, and I'm going to go through about a third of it, but I'll stop and ask for any questions. And you should feel free to put them in the chat box. I have to admit, I can't easily see the chat box, so I'm going to depend on Brian and Ava for them to make sure I don't miss anything. But I'll try and answer them during those question times, and at the end, we'll have more time also. So again, thanks for being here. My goal is to really try and put some of the evidence out there for what we know about the importance of informal STEM learning, and when does it happen that people get interested and excited about science? Because from my perspective, that's the #1 thing we want to do. Lots of times we get caught up on standards, what students should learn, what people should learn, but more important, we want to turn them into lifelong learners. So that's really the goal. I guess I'm officially presenting. Besides I'm at the Pacific Science Center, I'm now the president-elect of the National Science Teachers Association, the world's largest organization, professional organizations for science educators, not just teachers, but people who work in science centers, after-school programs, universities, and so on. So looking forward to that. And this discussion we're having today fits in nicely with my presidential theme. You have to have a presidential theme. And that is making science learning lifelong, life-wide, and life-deep. So it really focuses on that out-of-school learning. And some of this is obviously clear, lifelong, making science learning that someone engages with throughout their lives. The other two might not be as obvious, but life-wide really means that you want to encourage people to experience and engage with science, not only in school, which is where a lot of people think science seems to happen, science learning, but at home, after school, summer camps, museums, pick up another location. And then life deep. The idea that not everybody's going to become a professional scientist, but that may be how deep they go. But the goal would be to have individuals decide to be maybe an amateur astronomer or to work on a citizen science project. But even if they don't get that involved, but as long as they like the idea of going to the internet and learn about science or watching media about science, that may be the right level. The whole goal is to make people engaged and interested in learning about science. So that's the theme, and it fits in nicely with the overall presentation I want to do. And I have to admit, I don't just have a presidential theme, I have a presidential dream. And that is that I like to see that we have science as pervasive as sports in our society. And you can imagine in school science, after school science, intermediate science, that will pick up science activity in the local park. All those sorts of things you would envision for science, for sports, you really want to happen in science. The big question is, how do you know when you've made it? And I even have a measurement for that. And that is when you have to rush home for Monday night science. That's sort of the image that's there. And of course you have to have, if you're going to have that, you have the logo wear. I actually have a cup, I'll bring one here with a Monday Night Science logo on it. I have pins, you can see sweatshirts, t-shirts. There's a website and a Facebook page, so feel free to go to Monday Night Science on Facebook or to the website. Actually, the Facebook is more active, and certainly like the Facebook page. The goal is, how do we start getting people to think about making science as pervasive as sports? Of course, it's nice to have a dream and a theme, but how do we know out-of-school learning works? And one way to think about this is how much time, especially K-12 students, since often we're dealing with youth, spend in the classroom. And you can see from this nice diagram that a typical student spends less than 20% of their time. Now, these are the awake hours. 20% of their awake hours in a school classroom. So there's 80% of their time outside of the classroom. So how do we capitalize on that? And if you really think about this in that whole lifelong, life-wide, life-deep, we want this not just be something that's happening in school, but something that happens throughout a person's lifetime. And when you look at it that way, a typical 80-year-old person, assuming the person lives to 80, spends only 5% of their life in the classroom, in formal education. So it's a very small period of time. And what we don't want to have happen is that people to leave the formal classroom setting and not want to do any more science. And it's, one of my saddest stories, I have to tell this, is I was up on the Olympic Peninsula, which is here in Washington State. I'm located in Washington State, doing some photography, which is one of my lifelong interests, with a couple of friends who worked at our State Department of Education. And we were at dinner one night and we were being served by a high school student. And so the two people that were there, one of them was in charge of assessment. So he was very interested in how well that student did on the state science test. So, he was very anxious and, how did you do? What was, how was it difficult? How well did you do? Said, oh, I think I did fine. I'm just glad I never have to take any more science. If that's the way students are coming out of school science, or science in general, then we failed. The number one thing we want to do is to encourage this engagement, lifelong interest, motivated to learn more about science. That should be the number one thing. We get caught up on science tests, science assessments. We have the next generation science standards. Here's all the things you should learn. And I think it's great. She learned them. She was able to pass the test. But if she doesn't want to learn anymore, then I think we failed them, to say the least. And it's interesting to think about, where does all this learning come from? Because if you go away from, let's not take science, let's take another topic. One I always have fun with is cooking. So I often talk with groups about their interest in cooking. I can't see all of you. I can only see 4 of you at a time. But when I do this with large groups, I often talk about their interest in cooking or going out and having a good meal. I mean, I'm assuming a lot of you like to go out for a nice meal. You learn about the newest restaurants, what's the food they're offering, that sort of thing. When I ask people in an audience how many are interested in going to good restaurants, almost everybody raises their hand. And then it's, well, I assume a lot of that turns into an interest in cooking and looking at recipe books and doing that sort of thing. And so then I ask people how many of you have an interest in, cooking and making nice meals for members of the family or friends? And you get about 2/3 of the audience, something like that. The real question I'm after at the end is, how many of them learned how to cook by going to a formal cooking class? Last time I did this, out of 50 people, 1 person raised their hand. Many of the things that we develop long life interests in don't happen because we went to school. We developed it otherwise. Same thing, my interest in photography, which is one of my interests, I never took a formal class. It's just something that I developed. Actually, after I developed that interest, I did take some photography classes. So we know that developing interest in something doesn't have to happen in school, and a lot of it happens outside of school. And so what we want to do is to think about a learning ecology, a STEM learning ecology, if we want to put it that way. The idea that a person spends their time doing all these things. They're in school, but they're in after school. They have summer camps. They go to a museum. They watch the media. They go to, they have to go to a faith-based institution. They're at home. All of these are places for learning to happen. And that's critical in my mind. And we'll be looking at the evidence here in a second in terms of what do we know about the evidence for the impact of out-of-school learning, and at what age do you really need to impact people. and to emphasize why it's so important to be out of school, so this is some recent data that just came out. I'm actually going to a meeting in DC next month about this. This is a study by Horizon Research doing a big survey of how much time is spent on science in the classroom. And I'm looking at the elementary grades because we're going to find out later on that if you want to develop an interest in science with people, you need to do it before they turn 12 years old. Once you get beyond 12, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen after 12 years old, but it's much harder. So all the better to get to them. But as you can see here, there's 18 minutes a day spent on science compared to almost 90 on language arts and 60 on math. It gets a little bit better in the grades 4 through 6. And you could say, well, let's just do more science. Well, if you do more science, then you're going to have to take it away from something else because the day's only so many hours long. There's only 180 days of school per year. So it's very difficult to cram more science into the school day. So what we need to do is to do more outside of school. So I'm going to go on and talk more about the evidence for out of school learning, but I want to take some questions now if there are any. Not that we have to have any now. And again, Ava and Brian, I appreciate your help because I can't see the chat box very easily. Are there any questions there?
We don't have any yet, Dennis, but we need to give them time to type.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I'll definitely.
Jennifer notes that she would love to see the chart to share, and maybe if you're willing to share the slides in general, that would be, some of them might appreciate that.
I will be happy to do that. I'll get that to the ASP after I'm done here, and so people can have the entire PowerPoint.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and share that on AFGU in the same spot that the announcement for this was. And if anyone found out about this webinar from a source that is not AFGU, message me privately on the chat with your email, and I will make a note to email you that info.
Okay, well, I'll move on if there's not any other comments at the moment.
If anyone has any comments, please make sure that you add those, and we'll make sure that Dennis knows about them. And with this small of a group, I'm sure we'll have a chance later on. Don't feel shy about unmuting yourself and turning your camera on so that we can hear you and see you.
Yeah, sounds good. So I want to go through some of the research that's been done. I'm going to start with research done in 2006 by Robert Tye and his colleagues. Again, a lot of this research is about either careers or science, interest in science, when does it happen, for me, it's not so much what did they, what's going to improve standard tests, but what's going to develop this interest. So this is one that was in AAAS's Science magazine. Oh, and this says, this is a study of 12,000 eighth graders over 12 years. So they started surveying, getting answers from the eighth graders over a 12-year period of time. So clearly from the time they were in eighth grade until they were in college. And one of the highlights that's interesting is, first of all, if they're, what they found is if a person's going to go into science, typically they develop their interest in science. It says by eighth grade because they started in eighth grade, but it really happened before that. So this highlights the need to do something early, obviously. The other thing that was really interesting in this, because a lot of the statements that you hear out there is how important math is, that math achievement was not a predictor of a person pursuing a science degree in college. That doesn't mean they didn't do reasonably well in math, but just because they did well in math, there are lots of people that went into science, even if they didn't do that well in mathematics. And I know that very well, actually, since that fits me to the T when I was in high school. So here's another one a little bit later, 2010. Sources of early interest in science. You'll see these Robert Tye and Adam Maltese again have done a lot of this work. This one was looking at scientist and STEM graduate students to try and understand what they, what got them interested. So 65 of the reported interest in science started before middle school. Again, you'll just see this over and over again. So if you really want to go work with people, and it's interesting because you look at a lot of the presidential, even during Obama's, it's like we should do all these things at high school. Actually, I don't want to say that's too late. Nothing's ever too late. But the real need is at these early experiences in the elementary school. And again, not just in school, but after school and so on. The other thing that was interesting was that what they found was females' interest in science was more likely sparked by school-related experience, but males were more likely sparked by out-of-school activities. And these could be many things. Matter of fact, my interest in science got started because I did science fair projects in middle school and high school. And that got me totally excited about science. I did a 9th grade science project where I collected dirt from gutters and consulates all over the world and looked for micrometeorites. And that actually, if I had to pick a time, that was what hooked me into wanting to be an astrophysicist and actually following that. So this idea, again, early development, often out of school activities have a major influence. So now, this is another 2014, so not too many years ago, another study that really focused on generating interest. Now this looked at both people who had STEM careers and non-STEM careers, but looking at their interest in STEM, not necessarily going into careers, which of course for me, this is actually the more critical area in a way. So this looked at 8,000 individuals and what caused their interest in STEM. So included interest in STEM and not STEM. And really what they found was there wasn't a single pathway. They both in school and out of school. And if you look at the details, and you can get any of these journal articles if you want to look at more detail, about a third of the people, I think it's a third. I mean, I get into astronomical accuracy, I have to be careful about that. But I'd say about a third said that they just had an interest in science. They couldn't really say it was because they did something in school or out of school or parents or whatever it might be. The next two large pathways to interest were either teachers or parents. Parents came in second. So what's happening at home is very important. But it's clear these things happening in school and out of school are really critical. So that's the research that's out there that really focuses specifically on talking to people about their interest, why they went into a career. It's kind of linear in my mind. It looks at individuals and over time, which is fine. But I think a more interesting article to look at is one from the American Scientist in 2010. I want to make sure it's the American Scientist. Yeah, American Scientist in 2010, where there's two researchers, John Falkenlund and Dierking, tried to nuance where learning occurred about science. And so you'll have to follow this argument. It's an interesting one. And you'll notice the 95% solution really relates back to the fact that a person who reaches 80 years old spends 5% of their time in the classroom. This is the other 95%. So this looked at a number of indicators. So first of all, I went to the TIMSS report and PISA. These are two, if you're not familiar with them, two international tests on science achievement. And people in the United States lament over and over again how poorly people in the US or students in the US do. And that has not improved over the years. I mean, it's been going on for over a decade, if not longer. One thing that's interesting is in the PISA test, they not only have to do a science assessment test, but they answer a number of questions, essentially a survey. And what you find is that students who achieve high on the PISA test also achieve high on the, or achieve high, are high high participants in out-of-school experiences. Now, the big question, of course, is this correlational? Is there any cause and effect? It could be that because they're a high achiever in science, they do a lot more out-of-school experiences. One could argue that they do a lot of out-of-school experiences in science, and that makes them a high achiever. So unfortunately, we only have correlation. But it's an intriguing question to be looking at. What the researchers then did was to look at, so how well do US adults do in terms of science performance? How science literate are they? One thing they noted was that only 30% of adults in the US take just one, even one, not just one, even one science course in college. Of course, some people don't go to college, but clearly they're not getting a lot of science in college. Yet when you look at indicators of adults' understanding of science, their science literacy, US adults tend to outperform other people in the rest of the world, which is kind of a fascinating. So if we're not doing well in school, why are we outperforming those people that would do well in school? So as they look at it, they then went further. They actually have done some research with adults to ask, now, where did you get your science knowledge? Where do you go? School actually ranks low on the list of where they get their science knowledge. And many more of the places are out-of-school resources, the internet, media, museums, etc. So this would point to the fact that maybe it's this out-of-school that's really having this impact, because that's why the adults are doing so well. The other two things they point out, which don't deal specifically with science, but it points out the importance of out-of-school learning, is some research that was done in Philadelphia about school groups, comparing low-income school groups to suburban affluent school groups, and what happens to them during the summer when suburban groups have a rich out-of-school experience and the other doesn't, and the low-income youth tend to backslide more during the summer. And somewhat of this is, you could say, well, that's intuitive. And all these opportunities have rich experiences, whether it's in science or otherwise, means that students will have more background, more knowledge about whatever it might be, science, history, or whatever. The other thing was the Harvard Family Research Project, which has been doing research for more than 40 years, came to the conclusion that out-of-school complementary learning opportunities are major predictors of children's development, learning, and educational achievement. So all of these things put together from their perspective means that the 95% solution is the key. I want to do one more research project, a little more evidence, and then I'm going to ask for, see if there's any questions. This is a very recent one. You can see 2008. This is a project funded by the Department of Education in Virginia called STEM 360. You can see John Falk, who was one of the authors. He's involved with it, but it has a number of people from the Virginia Air and Space Center and other individuals. And this was a goal to try and do, everybody wants a double-blind, perfect design and experimental design. So this was an attempt to try and do something like that. And it's in its first year, so it really has another year or two to see if they, as they perfect it, whether it has impact. So you'll see that some of the outcomes aren't as strong as they could be, but it's a project to watch. So this project worked with 20 schools in 3 school districts in Norfolk, Virginia, a pretty low-income area. And it followed almost 1,600 students going from 4th grade through 5th grade. So it's not 2 different groups, they're all 4th graders for a while, and they go into 5th grade. And it wasn't just the Air and Space Center, but it was other ISE institutions in the area, the Botanical Gardens, the zoo, and so on. And they randomly assigned the schools to 3 different treatments. So here's the, it's kind of double-blind effort to try and figure this out. 3 different treatments, and also balance the gender and social economic status as much as it could. And what they did was to have these 3 different treatments. And I'm going to start down at the bottom. So level 3, the lowest, basically experienced what would be a typical classroom year involvement with an out-of-school science center or museum or whatever, essentially had an outreach program that came to the school one time. We do a lot of this here in the state of Washington with our outreach programs. Level 2 and level 1 had more involvement. So I'm not going to jump up to level 1. The biggest involvement was 4 field trips to these informal learning institutions, and then 4 outreach programs that came to the school. So there's 8 times that they get interaction with these ISEs. And then they also had a STEM coach that came from the Air and Space Center. And the family got essentially a family membership to the Air and Space Center and had special bi-weekly STEM Saturday events. So they had a very immersive experience during the year. Level 2 got almost the same thing, except they only got 2 field trips and 2 in-school outreach programs. But they also got this rich, immersive weekend experience. So this is level 1, 2, and 3. And of course, the goal is, well, does level 1 do a whole lot better than level 3 is really the question. So some of it is reasonably positive. Oh, I should point out what they looked at. They looked at STEM career awareness. So how much, beforehand, people would say, oh yeah, I think maybe be a doctor or a veterinarian, but they weren't really aware of the real breadth of career awareness. STEM engagement really means how much do they spend looking on the internet, following media, going to science museums, how much do they engage around science, or STEM in this case, I shouldn't just pick on science. STEM-specific topic interest really relates to what do they know about certain topics that were presented as part of the experiences going to the ISEs. And then the final one was looking at academic achievement. They actually looked at the scores of Virginia has a standardized state test at 5th grade, like most states. And so they were trying to see if there was any influence on the 5th grade standardized science test. The first 3 all had pre and post tests, so you could actually compare a person to a person. Unfortunately, the last one is only a 5th grade test, so you'll see how that turns out a little bit later. So I just want to look at some of the differences here. Here we have STEM career aspirations, clear impact on level 1 students, much broader understanding of what career options there are, not just be a scientist, but I would call science-based careers that deal with technology and that sort of thing. This is probably the strongest result they got. If you look at STEM engagement, this isn't as strong. It's slightly positive. The biggest factor here is that the level 1 and 2 talk more about having experiences at informal science institutions, but of course they actually were given more opportunity. So I'm not sure this says a lot yet, but maybe year 2 will tell us a lot more. Topic-specific interest, again, we see a pretty good jump of level 1 compared to the other 2. And finally, I will talk about STEM achievement. This is an area where I think it's pretty difficult, and I don't think they've really shown much here. What they were able to do was since they could only look at the 5th grade test, they had to go back and say, so how did those schools in aggregate do the last 2 years? So they looked at 2015-16 and 16-17 before the program, and then looked at 2017-2018. And certainly both level 1 and level 2 went up, but level 2 went up more than level 1. And level 3 went way down. And it's hard to believe. I mean, that's just, again, you're not comparing apples to apples. You're got apples to oranges and pears. So I think that this is not a very strong indicator. But again, I'm not sure that our goal is to really make sure people can do well on achievement tests. The goal is how do we develop that interest and excitement about STEM, science, certainly careers. More engagement is really important. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That's a good stopping place for presenting a lot of data, a lot of research.
Dennis, we have a question about one of the charts, and somebody from Greensboro Center asked, shouldn't all the students from the first graph, shouldn't they have started out at about the same level?
I don't know which, I'm not sure which graph it was. Now I'm going to pick this graph here. No, because it's a whole different set of students. So in the same way, if I go back to these scores here, the achievement scores, you'll see that depending on the school, schools that happened to be in level 3 before there was ever this program tended to rate much higher in their scores. So it's not, you can't really look at them all starting at the same level. What you need to be able to do, which is why the achievement scores doesn't work very well, you need to look at where they're starting to begin with and compare it to where they're starting afterwards. It's that pre and post that's really critical because they're different groups of people and because of that, they'll start in different places. Hope that answers the question.
If anyone has any follow-up questions or any clarifications, then please let us know.
Okay, well, I've got one more section here and then I'll open it up and we can have just a verbal conversation. So back to this slide I showed before. What this really all means when you look at it, it's we need to think beyond schools. I mean, schools are important, but too often, I mean, when I go out and talk to students often, they say, oh, what are you doing in science? I'll say, well, in school, I'm doing this. Well, how do we get people to think about, when you say, what are you doing in sports? They might say, I'm doing this in school, but it's just as likely they're saying, oh, I'm, on my a community league, or, we go, and we even go, we go to baseball games, we go to football, whatever it might be. There's this broader look at where sports happens, and what we need to do is to get people thinking about broader ways in which science happens, not only in schools, but through mass media, libraries, home, etc. So building this STEM learning ecosystem, as it's called, is really critical. And I have to point out, so one of the challenges has been, because if you look at what happens at both the state and federal level, the focus is on schools. States fund schools. So if you're involved at all at what's happening, you'll find, the state puts out so much money, it all goes into schools. And you hear a lot about how well students are doing in school, they're tested. Federal government, most of its money that it puts in through the elementary, secondary, secondary science education, no, Secondary Student Act, that's the SSA. I remember the acronym. Mainly goes for in-school activities. And fortunately, I think this is a big change. In December, the federal government put out a new STEM strategic plan. Every 5 years, Congress has mandated they do this. And this one came out, and a key element in it, and I have too many words here, but the highlighted ones are the most valuable. A key element, and if you go to it, go to page 13, is it basically says creative blended education opportunities are critical, and they result in learners gaining and building their skills in ways that work the best. So they now have federal government saying that we need to look at ways to bridge between in-school and out-of-school. And you can see that second paragraph really specifically talks about visiting science centers, museums, zoos, aquaria, and so on. Contributors, each of the contributors will better prepare their learners if they connect and coordinate with others. So this is really what that 360 STEM is doing. And I have to admit, the other thing that was mentioned in here that I think is really critical, if this interests you a lot about how to build these relationships between in-school and out-of-school, and to look at the importance of out-of-school learning, they also cited a new journal called Connected Science Learning, which I used to be the editor of, as a key resource for understanding how to build these kinds of bridges between in-school and out-of-school. So very exciting. The federal government is now on board to say connections between in-school and out-of-school, that out-of-school learning is really critical. And so I want to say a few words before I quit about connected science learning. Actually, if you have your phone handy, go to csl.nsta.org, or you can Google connected science learning, it'll bring it up. And you can see the latest issue. I don't have the latest issue in front of me. But it's now 3 years old, and it's a great place to look for the kinds of programs that really feature connections to out-of-school learning. And you'll see this is from the first issue. Issue 1 was the introduction of the whole idea of a STEM learning ecosystem. And that diagram I've used a couple times actually comes from this article by Bronwyn Bevan at the University of Washington. So you should bookmark csl.nsta. Actually, you can go to the top right, as you can see in this slide, and you subscribe, and that'll give you an alert once a month to tell you what the latest thing is. So feel free to go and subscribe. We always like to have more subscribers. It is free. You don't have to pay for it. And if you're an NSTA member, you get it automatically also. So join NSTA if you're not a member already, and then you'll automatically get it. But to give you a couple of examples of programs that I think are interesting. One was an article that came out about the Great Lakes Stewardship Initiative. This is a whole number of programs in the Great Lakes area. I don't know if anybody's online from Michigan. But this was actually a project where students developed signage for a nature area. So they had to learn the science, but it was also literacy focused because they had actually developed the signage, and then they actually installed it, as you can see here. So it's these kinds of experiences that makes it personal, it makes it relevant to them. This is in their community. That's one of the big things we know. There's a great new publication out if you're into understanding how people learn. I'll bring it here. It's called How People Learn Too, Learners, Context, and Cultures. And if you look in here, there's a whole chapter on motivation. And if you think about this whole idea of motivation is something that develops interest. So you want to, if you think about doing science, you want to figure out how to motivate that interest. And two of the things that are critical when you read that chapter is making it personal and making it relevant. I mean, not that there aren't other things. I always think of astronomy because I'm in it, you know, the amazing pictures and fascination. There are things about that that may not be personal or necessarily that relevant that are fascinating. But in general, making things personal and relevant are critical, and this is a good way to do it. There's another one called Dragonfly Detectives. It's a group of students who are actually collecting data for scientists who are studying dragonflies. So this is a citizen science opportunity. I think citizen science is one of these ways in which becomes relevant for students because they're now helping scientists. They're helping them about an environment typically that's in their area. So it becomes really, again, personal and relevant to them. And again, it's not in the school, it's out in the environment. And I should mention also, it's not necessarily that these kinds of programs should be for youth. It should also be for educators, and there's even articles in there about educators who get to connect with businesses here in the Denver area, in this case. So we need to think about this kind of learning in school and out of school, not just at the K-12 level, but throughout our lifetime. And I'm going to add one last thing, and then I'll just open it up for questions. If we're going to think about, and let's think about this, the federal government now has this in their strategic plan to do more out-of-school connections, then we really need to take a look at the policy and funding implications. You could argue that that STEM strategic plan is dealing with policy, so we need more of that. But the big challenge for me is the funding implications. When you look at where all the money goes, if you think about that chart that showed how much time was spent in school, how much time was out of school, well, this picture of a sailboat sort of represents that. The sailboat represents the time in school, and the great blue sea and sky represent the time out of school. The challenge is, if you look at the funding and policy efforts at the moment, it's more like this. It all focuses on that sailboat. Very little of it focuses on the great blue sea and the blue sky. And somehow we need to move both policy and funding, maybe not so it's exactly equal, but at least the boat isn't as dominant, or doesn't have as much of the money as it used to. More of it's going to that out of school. So I'm here, I'm after this dream. When can we make science as pervasive as sports? And when do we get to rush home to Monday Night Science? I'm not sure I'll see it in my lifetime, but that's certainly the dream. Many people think it's a fantasy, but it's certainly, I think, a great dream to keep in mind. So with that, I'm done. I'm happy to open it up and have a conversation.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dennis. This is fantastic to look at all these. Let's see if we have any good comments. So Alan Gold has a comment. He says, many informal institutions have a primary or implicit goal to simply get people in their doors or gates before proving any particular impacts on attendees. Could you recap the main goals of research studies that you mentioned, and have you or any of the other attendees here thought of other goals that might be worth investigating? So maybe we'll get some input from the collective here, one might say.
Sure, no, that's fair enough. And actually, I think we do worry about just getting numbers of people in science centers or zoos or whatever. And I think we spend a lot of time, I keep on getting questions about, well, should we, align our exhibits to the next generation science standards? And we keep on thinking of getting across science concepts. We even do that in a lot of our exhibits. There's certain science concepts that we think are really important. I'll go back to the number one goal, and that is how much have we excited, developed interest, motivated them to do more. And I don't think there's been very much done, although not that there's nothing that's been done, but some to look at what kind of impact do we have on that motivation, interest from visitors, not only when they're there, but after they've left. How to follow up 3 months later. It was a great study done a number of years ago, actually at the Lawrence Hall of Science, where Alan Gould has been, that when you talk to students, they went through an experience where they got to handle animals. It was kind of an animal lab. And when they left, people said, yeah, I played with the rabbit, I did this, it didn't seem like they learned very much. But they then followed up 6 weeks later, and those students, in that case they were students, had all this information that they remembered from their trip about, what a rabbit did, what a rabbit ate. It wasn't just rabbits, I picked rabbits arbitrarily. But the ability to pull out what it is that they learned, it isn't always what we want them to learn. That's the problem with a lot of the studies around informal learning. But we know that a lot of learning goes on from those studies. So I don't know if other people have thoughts. You certainly should unmute.
And feel free to unmute yourself. We'd love to hear you and even see you if you turn your camera back on. Jennifer, I know that if you had a more up-to-date computer with all those, that you would be participating. If you have anything else you'd like to add, Jennifer, make sure you put it in the chat. We'll relay it on to Dennis.
How many people are online? I can't really tell that.
We have, other than you and me, it looks like we have 20 people currently.
Okay, great.
Let's see, Alan says, how about a study to see impacts on knowledge about societal issues that require science for understanding?
I know some have been done. I can't sit here because it's not an area that I really engage with, but certainly there have been, the Museum of Science in Boston has been one of the most active in that area. And some museums have taken that on as a real effort, not typically for the informal visitor in a way, but more in programs that really get at societal issues. But I think that's a good question. I think science centers, and thinking beyond science centers, how do we get it so that people that tend to come to science centers tend to be science advocates. They're already engaged in science. They wouldn't be coming to the Science Center. How do we get out? I talk about them as being science aware. How do we get out to the people that are less science aware? And we can get to people who are, especially get to them where they're thinking about the kinds of issues that, if it may be water quality, certainly climate change, but the time to really get into water quality and climate change might be at meetings where there's issues coming up about use of water and so on. So how do we pull ourselves out of our cocoon of the science institution and go meet the audience where they are?
Well, of course, at Lawrence Hall, they also developed a couple of programs primarily for the formal community that had exactly, that goal of utilizing societal issues to drive some of the instruction in the classroom around these issues and what sorts of things does one have to consider. It was more of a high school type curriculum, but I think it did lapse down into middle school. I think that was, might have been CPUP, I think was one of them. And if Alan wanted to, relate some of that experience, I would be delighted if he unmuted himself, if he had the ability to do so.
Well, certainly CPUP is a school curriculum and is one of those looking at societal issues on water quality or water distribution, water related. Again, it's how do you do it in a less, a more informal way. Again, out of the formal classroom. How do you get it? One of the nice projects that I've been involved with is at the University of Utah on the STEM ambassadors. And they worked real hard at going to what they consider hard to, maybe it's not so much hard to reach, but unusual audiences. And some of them have been going to scientists actually going out. So these are scientists going out to talk with the public. And some of them have been going to hearings about water quality in Utah. As you can imagine, Utah has a real interest in water issues because it's a pretty dry state. But I mean, they've had programs that have gone to incarcerated youth and adults, but even to like rock climbing, doing geology with rock climbing groups, or going to cooking classes and talking about fermentation. So how do you connect a scientific subject to an interest that isn't necessarily, the participants don't necessarily think it's science.
Yeah. Well, Jennifer's got a comment here, and she notes that this really is one of the goals to create a welcoming and inclusive science opportunity. But she also notes that Detroit Lake in Oregon, where she was a park ranger, is 40 feet down this year. And she said that it's another drought equals an opportunity to talk about these issues. Again, back to some of the water issues that the West has been experiencing. And she notes that this kind of, a lot of times the science of recreation can help, build that engagement piece with these people to make it something that they can relate to.
I think that would be a perfect place to actually do an outreach program, would be go to campsites and nature centers. Again, you're making it personal and relevant, especially, people are concerned about the lake being down. That's the time to make it personal and relevant.
And then Jessica notes, it's very much tied to what you're speaking about, but wondered if you're aware of any research tied to out-of-school time and how these programs and experiences can help develop a science identity. Science is, for me, she notes, people like me do science, etc., among students. So helping develop a science identity among the students.
Yeah, I'm not aware, but I'm not a researcher, so I have to admit I'll show my ignorance. There probably are some out there. I'm actually going to go meet later this month with a researcher, Robert Tye, who's at the University of Virginia, because he's done a lot of the research. He's the person that I mentioned in a couple of these studies. And I guess I would say those studies that I've shown, although they didn't use the word identity, which I think is pretty kind of a new term, those studies that looked at those researchers, clearly all those researchers have a STEM identity, and the other studies that really looked at graduate students and so on that went into STEM, I think give a sense of where that STEM identity is about STEM identity, and you know, the number one thing for me, which comes out everywhere, is do it early. I mean, it's by sixth grade, and I'm sure this is true of other subjects. I mean, I just don't know them. You know, if you're interested in music, it starts early. So if you want to develop that interest, then you need to be working with kids early. And of course, that may be the reason if you start looking at these people that talked about where their STEM interest came, a lot of them just says it's intrinsic. So, you know, somehow growing up, they liked exploring in nature or putting things together or tearing them apart. But for a lot of them, it's the parents. So here's this influential, and it probably, you know, for parents, it started early. So if you look at that type of influence, then the STEM identity, it comes across, I think, pretty well in those couple of those research studies. I'm sure there might be more recent stuff that looks at identity as a construct, an actual intellectual construct, but I'm not familiar with them.
So Jessica was also wondering if you happen to have a link to that study from Lawrence Hall regarding the animal lab. She would appreciate knowing what that was.
Well, that's actually Alan Gould.
It was an anecdote. So.
You know, that was. I don't even know if it was published. It was a person. Sherman Rosenfeld, I think it was his name. Alan might remember him. Alan and I were at the Lawrence Hall of Science together, actually. I don't know, it was his thesis, his doctoral thesis, and what I don't know is if it was ever published. It was a discussion that came out after, you know, some years in talking to him. So unfortunately, I don't.
Yeah, Alan, if you have any insights into that, we'd... Oh, there he is.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if the mute or video function would actually work here, but it does. How about that? No, I don't know. I don't know about that particular research study, but there's a whole research group now at Lawrence Hall of Science that does various kinds of research on formal and informal education. But one thing I wanted to mention that's unrelated to that is I wanted to tie into something you said, Dennis, that had to do with hobbies, actually, getting the interest in science of hobbies, sort of like the science of hobbies and science as a hobby, that is a goal that we might think of and you know, and do studies on or make efforts towards.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, that's all part of Monday Night Science in my mind, you know, that some of these people that are, you know, the Lifedeep will pick a hobby. So you have an amateur astronomer, you have rock collectors, amateur fossil hunters, you know, you think of all those hobbies. Certainly the tinkering movement now, the maker movement is a huge, what I call hobby with maker fairs, do-it-yourself activities. And you know, the broader we can get those kinds of activities occurring, I agree. And my guess is that there may be a fair amount of research out there about the impact of that, but again, it's not an area I'm very aware of.
Well, don't forget the bird watchers either.
Oh yeah, sure. I didn't mean to leave anybody out. Insect collector, you know, you can go on. I'm back to cooking. You know, cooking and gardening. Now, most people would say, "Oh no, I'm not. I don't do any science." But if you're a good gardener or you're a good cooker, a good chef, a good cooker, a good chef, you know, kind of science that you're engaged in, and if we get people to think about themselves that way, then I think that might give them better, back to the science identity. They would say, well, gee, I really, now I should go and feel that there's other aspects of science I could really understand, especially if they seem a little science phobic, but yet they're good gardeners and good chefs.
Well, here at the Exploratorium in San Francisco, they have a lot of museums are doing these one night a week for adults. And so on their Thursday night after dark program for adults, one of the more popular things is called Pairings. It has to do with food and then some sort of beverage that would complement it. And they go into a lot about talking about the science of why these go together, the science of how they're made. And so there's a lot of that kind of crossover between, you know, kind of the science and then your personal experience of the food. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the STEM app project at the University of Utah is really trying to, how do you go, and this is all going out because they don't actually have a science center. They have scientists who, but they've gone to beer pubs and done the science of beer. I don't know if they've done wine, but I think it's how do you make it personal? How do you make it relevant? Much of what we do in school is not personal and not relevant.
Well, we're almost at the top of the hour, but Bob Reichman asked a really interesting question, and you might have some insight. He asked, do farm kids score higher in science attributes and or maybe literacy in general?
Say, I missed that. I missed the question. I got a little garbled again.
Do farm kids who grew up on a farm, score higher in science attributes and perhaps even in literacy because they're a little more connected to the natural world when they're living on a farm?
That's a very good question. Someone needs to study that, and maybe they have, but I have not seen anything that looks at, rural communities. I don't know. I guess you'd really like it to be growing up on a farm, but farm communities versus non-farm communities. Haven't seen that. And how do you then control for other, one of the big issues these days is that rural populations don't have access to a lot of the after-school programs and even in-school science programs that kids in suburban and urban areas. So how do you control for that? That's the other part that would be an interesting challenge. But, after you go way back to Dewey and the whole idea of what Dewey thinks about education, it was the idea that you go out and experience. And a lot of that was because when he was writing, people were on the farms and they learned by putting the tractor back together or, growing plants. And there really was this experiential learning. And that is a critical aspect. And of course, it was very relevant and personal to them because they were growing up on the farm. So how do we create that now in urban and suburban environments?
I actually have some friends who have a big ranch out in middle of nowhere in New Mexico, and they ended up keeping their kids home and homeschooled them. I think it was 4 hours to the nearest school, something like that. And the kids turned out to be, very well adjusted. Of course, he was very involved in an environmental organization, and I know that their daughter for sure has become very well known in bird conservation work and is very much in demand for her expertise. And so there's an anecdote that somebody who grew up on a big ranch turned out pretty well. I don't think that that's probably typical, but one anecdote doesn't make for a generalization, of course.
One data point isn't good enough.
No.
I appreciate these thoughtful comments and questions. I wish I had more answers, but they're all really good. I appreciate people participating in the webinar.
Well, we have a lot of people that really appreciated the information and the thoughtfulness of the program, and they appreciated the thoughtfulness of some of the questions and comments too. So, but we are at the top of the hour, so I want to thank Dennis very much for sharing with us for the last hour. And to answer Janice's question, yes, this is recorded, and I think that Ava will probably send the link around tomorrow. So thank you so much, Dennis.
Thanks, Dennis.
And I'll send the PowerPoint to all right, thank you. Good to see you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.